So today we're going to be doing some cherry blossoms with ink and watercolor. So you can already see that I have my sketch already started where I was inspired by kind of this drawing, but then also kind of incorporated some elements from this picture. So it's kind of fun, not to do exactly someone's drawing, to kind of make the composition your own. So like on this one, I could have, had more turned flowers, which is really interesting, including some bulbs, things like that. Because you want to also be knowing kind of what you're drawing, not just kind of blindly copying someone else's drawing. So what I'm going to start with first is just kind of outlining the drawing I already have transferred. I transferred it using my 6B pencil on the back of my drawing. And then what I can do now is, since cherry blossoms are kind of a fine flower, I really want to make sure I'm using kind of a thin tipped marker. So this one's like an 03. You could always go a little bit smaller. And then I'm also putting just some little hints of kind of the little stamen and pollen and all that onto my flower. I don't want to go crazy with that because I can always add more later. So you want to try and not get too carried away when you start on your shading or start adding some of the little details, just because you can always add more, but you can't really take it off. So once I had this all outlined, which I probably won't outline the whole entire thing before I start talking about how we're going to start the watercolor, is you want to try and think about how you would go about your shading, because petals, even though they're pretty smooth, they always have some dark areas and some light areas. You can especially tell in this photo how there's some really big shadows on here and sometimes just little subtle shadows. I would keep it pretty subtle. Like on this one, you wouldn't want to fill it all with black marker, because that might get a little distracting. So you can kind of see some of the high contrast shadows. It's just using a little bit of hatching to put it in. So I could just use just some very fine lines to put a hint of a shadow, and you can even do little hatches on either side of a highlight, and that'll make your highlight pop up really well. And then in the middle, it's pretty dark, so I could just very lightly kind of go back and forth and doing a scribbling motion to kind of get some nice shadows in there. So once I had this all, filled in and outlined, I could always come back in and do some thicker lines in some areas to make a little more contrast. So see, just going over that line one more time makes it show up a little bit more. So I wouldn't do this everywhere, but just maybe in some small areas where you want your eye to go a little bit, or even to make the flower look a little bit more crinkled. And when I'm ready to do kind of the wood or the branch of my flower, I want to try and make sure that we can differentiate kind of the branch from the flowers. So I could do, a similar shading technique, but maybe I would do it in a different direction. Or sometimes you can do lines that kind of replicate the feeling of wood. And then we'll probably do a little bit of dry brushing on that as well with our watercolor. So now what I want to do is start moving into my watercolor. Obviously you would want this to have this all shaded in, all drawn, all that fun stuff. So what I'm going to start with first is very light pink, because cherry blossoms are obviously mostly pink. Sometimes you get some that are a little bit of a different color, but the main color and what they're known for is kind of this really light pink. So what I'm going to start with first is looking for the lightest light in here besides white. So to make a really light pink, what you can do is use sometimes alizarin crimson, or if you have a rose madder, that's a really good pink too. And you want to take a little bit of that pink and really, really add a lot of water to it, just so it's a really nice light wash. And then from there, I just want to go over the whole entire petal, except for any areas I want to leave white. So, and if you have some of those little yellow pollen dots, you probably want to leave those white, just because yellow doesn't go over pink very well since it's close to red, and red's a pretty dominant color. So I'm just looking kind of for going over my shadows, leaving a little hint of white at the very tips. And this is just a start, so it looks really, really light at this point, but we'll be doing lots more layers, and that'll add more depth to your flower. And I'm not really worried about my pencil lines at this point because I can always erase them later. And also I can just go over with ink the areas I haven't done with that pink yet. So, and then once this first layer would be dry, or just a little bit drier, I could take a little bit more of that red. And especially in the middle of cherry blossoms, they're really, really bright. So I'm just gonna kind of tap in some of that brighter pink. I could always touch up a little bit in the petals. And I don't want to do the yellows just yet because that's going to bleed all into my flowers if I try and work on that right now. And then to make my pink a little bit darker, I can add a little bit of Payne's gray to it, which will make kind of a nice purple. I can add that into the center, and I don't want to go crazy with that because that's going to keep spreading. So you want to be very patient when you're adding more layers. So while my flowers are drying, since I can't really add an additional layer while they're still very wet, I could go ahead and do some layers on my branch. So for cherry blossom branches, they're kind of a pinkish brown. So you want to try and match, kind of that color. I might start with maybe the pink I already had and maybe add a little bit of burnt sienna to it, and that'll make kind of a nice brownish pink. And I'm just going to do a very light wash of that color over all of my branches. And it's up to you if you want to have your branches, fade off the page. Or if you want to have them just, kind of stop at the end. That's up to you. I normally like to kind of have them fizz out at the end. So once I've painted that area, I'll probably take a little bit of water and fuzz the very ends, and that makes it a little more interesting. So, and also these little things on here are also part of the stem over here. And I could take a little bit more of my burnt sienna. And if I needed to darken my burnt sienna, a great thing to use is ultramarine blue, just because blue and orange are complements. So brown, or at least burnt sienna, is kind of an orangey brown. So if you add a little bit of ultramarine to burnt sienna, it helps to tone it down. So I'm just going to put a little bit of that darker color kind of at the bottom of my branch. And then probably that's a good place to stop on that. And then these are a little bit, drier. So I'm going to come back in with some of that nice light pink again. And I'm going to take my pink and actually add a little bit of ultramarine blue to it to make some shadows. And I'm just going to put it in some of those little shadow areas. Because if you look at the picture, the shadows are pink, but they're also a little bit purpley. So to make that nice kind of subtle purple, that's where I can add my alizarin and my ultramarine blue. And then once this was a little bit drier, then I would come in and kind of just pop in some of those yellows. And then for my little leaves, those would also be kind of that brownish color, or you could kind of have them, a little brown, maybe a little bit of green on the tips just to make it more interesting. But those little details are probably one of the last things you want to work on. But if you have time or you need a break, it's totally fine to work on those a little bit. So that's how I would start your cherry blossoms, and then just more and more layers to get more of that color. I know it's a little hard to see kind of the colors on the camera, but it'll just take more colors. You want to make sure you're not afraid of color the more layers you work on, but also try and not get rid of kind of these nice little highlights that you'll get on your painting.